welcome to this very special conversation with Chief Economic Advisor Dr. Nageswaran. It is my absolute pleasure and delight to have him in this conversation after the economic survey. So thank you so much for taking out the time. This conversation is for India Foundation, and this is in the backdrop of the survey, which projects a very positive outlook for the Indian economy, more so in the context of the global economic outlook. And in the last fortnight, I have seen some of your interviews. This interview has the luxury of going through several of your earlier ones, and several statements stayed with me, and I'm going to quote one of them, in fact, which, you know, and you said that the economic survey is actually an annual economic story, so to say. You know, it presents a picture. And in your assessment, what is the India economic story for the next 12 months, 24 months, or even beyond?
Okay. The next 12-month story is one of continued economic growth, the momentum having been set in 21-22, continuing this financial year. I mean, given the way the budget of 22-23 presented last year, and within a few weeks the conflict in Ukraine broke out, and then over the next 4 to 5 months you saw commodity prices, oil prices shooting through the roof, and but having navigated it through government's proactive supply measures, central bank hiking interest rates, and the government ensuring adequate supply of food and fuel inside the country first. And the estimate today is that we will grow at about 7% in real terms for the current financial year. That's a very creditable achievement. The only country within G20 that is going to grow faster than this is Saudi Arabia, which, because of the oil boom this year, is going to grow faster than India. But in the G20, this is the best growth rate apart from Saudi Arabia. And next year, even though the international agencies project a slightly lower growth for India, it is still one of the probably the fastest growth rate. So India's growth momentum, I think, and the steady recovery, putting the creating a distance between the impacts of the pandemic and the economy, that is steadily marching on. I mean, there is no question about that. And the reason is that we had a difficult second decade because the financial system, the banking system, overextended itself in the first decade of the millennium. And we therefore had to do an adjustment and what I call digestion of the excess credit we created, excess loans we created. So did the corporate sector. They had to reduce their balance sheet, sell assets, pay off debt, etc. All that is now behind us. And therefore, I expect the financial cycle and the capital investment cycle to be in our favor. What were headwinds last decade is going to turn into tailwinds this decade. And the second reason for my hope and optimism about the Indian economy is that the digital transformation of the economy, and it was not just because of the pandemic, but even before that, the building blocks were put in place, and that is also going to continue to propel growth in the country, drawing segments of the population which were not hitherto included in the formal economy. So this is the running theme for us, this not just for the next 12 months, 24 months, but even beyond. So it is the formalization, financial inclusion, facilitated by digitization, and the resumption of the credit and capital investment cycle. That is what will drive India's growth, not only in the next 12 months, but 24 months and beyond as well.
Yes. And you know, interestingly, you also said that when you talk about growth projections, there is a variation, of course, between, and that typically happens, you know, that the finance ministry projections, the economic survey, what the government says, and what actually happens, you know, that is there. And plus what the international agencies also project, you know, those variations exist. And I'm very intrigued to say that you actually said that numbers give us a false sense of precision. But how far off could we be from these numbers, and are there any reasons to worry for us to be off this track?
Look, I mean, how far we could be from the numbers that we are projecting for 23, 24? I mean, you could be, I mean, that itself is a question which is difficult to forecast. So, forecasting how far off your forecast will be from reality is also, is also as challenging as making the initial forecast. So, I would not venture into that. But I do give some clues as to where I see the balance of risks lies. When I picked the number of 6.5% as real GDP growth for 23-24, deliberately I gave the range as 6 to 6.8 rather than saying the range is 6 to 7 and my baseline is 6.5. I could have said that, but I picked the range as 6 to 6.8, telling you that the downside risk is higher than the number being exceeded. So 6.5 is my base case scenario, but it could go all the way up to 6 on the lower side, but on the upper side it could only go up to 6.8. So I'm adding only 0.3 to the upper end, but adding 0.5% on the lower end of the range. So that kind of tells you that I see still challenges, and those challenges stem primarily from the global environment. We have no idea of what will happen to the conflict in Ukraine, how it will develop in this year, and also what impact will it have on the price of crude oil and the supply of crude oil. I mean, last week we saw Russia deciding to cut the oil supply by 500,000 barrels per day. And therefore, and also we do not know the speed with which or the smoothness with which Chinese economy will reopen and what kind of demand it will create for commodities. And should the US and European economies avoid a complete economic recession, then it will also add to the demand for fuel, etc. Then we need to see how that will impact oil supply, oil prices. So much of the risk that India faces stems from external factors, and those uncertainties are still quite big. So there are large number of unknown unknowns, and that is why I feel while the baseline number is 6.5%, I do see downside risk dominating the upside.
And in fact, 6% is what the IMF also projected, closer to that. So yes, there are fair bit of risks to this growth rate. But you know, if we were to talk about the global economy, there are one side, of course, is that you know, if China opens up faster, it grows faster, there will be accordingly a major spike in commodity prices and so on and so forth. The other side to it is that, you know, we're looking at probably the global economy reaching its lowest in terms of growth rates, you know, whether you talk about the Europe, largely the European market.
That's right.
That will have a direct bearing on our exports as well, and, you know, our economy. Yeah. And how do you see that panning out?
No, it's a fair question. I mean, so obviously, whatever happens in the global economy, whether it is performing better than expected 3-4 months ago or performing worse than expected 3-4 months ago, both will have their own implications for India. And those implications will be a mix of good and bad. And ultimately, we have to come to a judgment on balance, whether the good effects dominate the negative effects or vice versa. Yes. So with that framework in mind, I can say that a global economic slowdown will be on balance more beneficial to India than a global economy that does better than what we expected a few months ago. And the reasons are, yes, you are absolutely right, export growth will be impacted. But remember, India's services growth are mostly recession proof in the developed world. Just about 2 hours ago, a major IT company executive visited me, and he was also telling me, based on empirical record over the last couple of decades, when the global advanced economies slow down, the demand for IT services from India comes from their need to tighten back-end operations and control cost. When their economies are doing well, the need for India's IT-enabled services come from their front end, wanting to expand their markets and so on. So whichever way their economies are going, one or the other side of the company's operations seem to be having the need to use Indian IT-enabled services. That's a good thing. So services are reasonably recession-proof, and we can verify that with the data as well. And of course, goods exports will be hurt. But set against this, what are the benefits? Global oil demand will come down, imports will be lower, oil price will come down, the central banks in the developed world will stop raising interest rates, may even drop them, and therefore the pressure on the US dollar to appreciate will be less intense. That will provide relief to many emerging economies and currencies, including India. And therefore, developed country investors will be looking for investment opportunities because their economies are slowing. They will look for opportunities elsewhere in countries like India, which have a current account deficit, and therefore they need to, and India needs external financing. That will become a lot easier. So you have these multiple benefits. And against that, there is a little bit of impact on goods exports. So I would consider this, the positives outweighing the negatives of a global slowdown. That is why I will be somewhat relieved to see a world economy doing somewhat less better or somewhat worse than expected.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and by all accounts, the projections seem to indicate that for the European market.
But I must say that in the last, since the beginning of the year, the feeling is that the European economies have dodged a recession because the winter has been much warmer than expected, and therefore gas prices haven't gone up. And the US economy, even with the most recent employment data, seems to be pretty strong. So at the moment, I would say the indications are that the global economy would be performing better than what we thought, let's say, in October 2022, when the IMF brought out its World Economic Outlook. But in January, the World Economic Update that they provided was a tad better in terms of sentiments. And China's reopening and the speed with which the reopening happened was also completely unanticipated. So we have to wait and see.
So China is like the X factor in the equation right now, you know, because
you could say that.
How far it will grow, how fast it will grow, and also how much will there be, some sort of clawing back on the globalization sentiment. I wouldn't say that, you know, there'll be alternate supply chains, but some sort of China plus sort of an,
Yes.
So all that, of course, has a direct bearing on the India story and the manufacturing side of it. How do you foresee India's presence in these supply chains that are getting realigned? Because, you know, one of the most unfortunate parts is that we've been stuck at 15%, you know, the manufacturing. Yeah, you know, 15 and a half, 16, that's where we've been stuck for decades. As the Chief Economic Advisor, how do you see these global scenario pushing that upwards?
No, I think this global scenario does provide us an opportunity. I would say India's industrialization story is not a story of missed opportunities, but it is a story that is still waiting to unfold, because I think we never really had the kind of infrastructure that facilitates this manufacturing growth. Now we have that. There is a certain critical mass, whether it is roads, railways, ports, telecom network, digitization. I think we do have the building blocks that can facilitate a rapid growth in manufacturing. And also the geopolitical environment is making many companies, even though they may not spell it out very clearly for various reasons, they are looking for opportunities, and India provides the scale and the capacity. Definitely they are going to also countries like Vietnam, Bangladesh, Mexico, etc. But all those countries being relatively smaller compared to India will have at some point limitations in capacity creation, etc. Whereas India provides a large domestic market for these companies, but also the ability to set up manufacturing at scale. And I think what India is therefore aiming to do is to create local manufacturing capacity at scale to be able to cater to domestic and overseas markets. And that, I think, is a story that can happen and will happen. The entire production-linked incentive scheme is geared towards making that happen. And it is too premature to talk about its success or failure, because many of those sectors under the PLI were opened up only in 2021. Therefore, you receive applications in 2022, take time to evaluate, and then you grant them the license approvals, and then they go about setting up the capacity, and then they start producing, and then they start exporting. So this is not something that's going to happen at the speed with which one can write out a tweet. So it is. So I think the PLI scheme, the National Logistics Policy, and the PM Gati Shakti program are all elements of the India's manufacturing becoming a force to reckon with in the economy, and I think it's an important policy goal. I'm confident that global conditions are also getting aligned with India's goal for its own manufacturing.
And how soon do you see this panning out? You're right that, you know, manufacturing doesn't happen overnight. It takes its own time to materialize. But we've got some of those building blocks, like, you know, infrastructure costs are now going down for companies. Power is now a lot more stable in terms of power supply. And how do you see that now in the next, let's say, 3 years or 5 years, that kind of an outlook in terms of impact on manufacturing?
I think in the next 3 to 5 years, we must see the results of all these policy initiatives. And unfortunately for us, what has happened is, even as these policy initiatives are being rolled out, we have faced one-off shocks, starting from the pandemic and then followed by the commodity price shock and then the synchronized monetary policy tightening. So naturally, what happens is investors tend to become cautious. They want to reevaluate in the light of a higher cost of capital for them, and then in the light of higher commodity prices, and then they look at Suez Canal blocked for 2 weeks by a ship that got stranded there, etc. And they have to factor in a lot more risk elements in their calculations before they invest. So many of these exogenous or external developments of the last 12 to 24 or even longer months naturally makes investors cautious and a little bit slower in responding. And that is why we feel a little bit frustrated and concerned that the results are not showing. But once these one-off shocks slowly go out of the system, we will begin to see the results of the various policy initiatives meant to push India's manufacturing share higher.
And as a policy maker, do you now think that the policy framework is nimble-footed? It is responding as fast as it can. It's not cast in stone. It wants to attract investments and is sort of responding.
I think it is quite. I would say yes to all of those questions, and I think because the intent is very clear, whether it is in public pronouncements or actual policy decisions, and then the decisions being taken to, supplement and complement the PLI with a logistics policy, with the Gati Shakti, which enables government projects to be implemented within time and cost overruns, and then a tax policy that allows lower tax rate for new manufacturing established within the country, which has now been extended to cooperatives as well, and then the reduction in the corporate tax rate in September 2019 that allowed the corporates to rebuild their financial health. So these are all part of the policy package, and they're acting in sync. So there is quite a bit of clarity and sure-footedness in terms of doing our best to achieve these aspirational goals, and the creation of public infrastructure by the government when the private sector was still repairing its balance sheet and sort of getting back to good health. So all of these things are quite clearly focused on the idea and aspiration of bringing India's manufacturing onto the global stage and plugging India into the global supply chain networks.
When we talk about aspiration, we talk about a $10 trillion economy. We talk about those numbers. I know those cannot be achieved overnight, but those are aspirations that most of India has. And do you share them? Do you see us realizing them? Is there a path that you see for that?
No, at a personal level, I do not subscribe to this idea of these number-based GDP targets. They are placeholders. But it is a sort of but media and several commentators are very sort of focused on these numbers, and they try to pinpoint as if the government said we would reach X number in terms of GDP by this year. But we know that to achieve a particular level of GDP, it is not just the government policies or efforts or project implementation. It is a whole lot of factors well beyond our control happening outside our borders, etc., that matter. So, in fact, it is not just a philosophical statement in line with what the Lord said in Bhagavad Gita. It is what is in your control is your efforts. And whatever we must do with the government sector, with the private sector, with households, we need to do. Whether they result in a particular GDP outcome this year or next year depends on other factors also beyond your control. But you must keep doing what you have to do. So that is my personal philosophy. But having said that, I think right now in March 23, we are going to have a GDP level of about $3.5 trillion, $3.5 trillion. And just to give you a sense of where we came from, in 1993, our GDP was only around $300 billion, and we're talking about $3.5 trillion in 30 years, 10 times. And in dollar terms, therefore, we have grown at a rate of about 9.1, 9.2% per annum in dollar terms. Nominal GDP, and this in spite of the fact that rupee was depreciating all these years from 30 or 32 in 1993 to about 83 right now. So we have still achieved a 9% annual growth in dollar terms. So It is eminently doable. So I in fact said in my post economic survey press conference interviews, or even before that, from 3.5 in 2023 March to get to 7 trillion by 2030 March, a 7-year period, is possible, because the rule of 72 tells you you just need to grow at 10% per annum in dollar terms to get to that number. And we have achieved 9% growth in the last 30 years on average. And you could face the next 7 years a situation when the dollar exchange rate actually, rather than Indian rupee depreciating, might even appreciate, because interest rates in the developed world may not go up so much, and the inflation rates are not going to be as low as before. So in real terms, their interest rates could be quite low or even negative. And that doesn't make the case for a stronger dollar. So in fact, if the Indian rupee, rather than depreciating, if it were to appreciate, and it will happen even faster. So to talk about $7 trillion by the end of the decade isn't particularly outlandish.
Yes, no, that's very, very positive, and that's very good to hear, because we're also an economy which has the largest population of young people. Right. They need jobs, they need skills, and that's our biggest force. And that demographic dividend needs to materialize, and it can only happen when you have such growth engines. As we sort of wrap this conversation, Dr. Nageswaran, last concluding thoughts in terms of some of the important initiatives that the government is taking, whether it is in terms of free trade agreements that it is looking to ink, whether it's in terms of coming up with newer ideas to look at fresh growth avenues. What do you see these areas as potential, growth inflection points, or how do you see them?
The growth inflection, as I mentioned earlier to your first question, I think is going to come from the resumption of the credit and capital investment cycle. And the other inflection point for us has been the advancement in digital technology and digitization of the Indian economy. But the free trade agreements that we are signing are going to help us with our energy security and energy transition and opening up markets for exporters, even though initially some of these free trade agreements may actually result in a widening of the trade deficit, because we are going to lower our duties more than they do, because we start from a higher level of duties. Yes. And if you are a country with a trade deficit with the other country with whom you are signing an agreement, the country with the trade deficit will be the one that will give in more. Yeah. And therefore, you will initially see imports coming in. Yeah. But that should not discourage us, because eventually you are creating a market, opening a market for India's exporters. So that is why, in fact, one of the important things I want to leave, to leave you and your readers with is that we often think in terms of what the government should be doing when it comes to economic growth, but there is plenty that the private sector, that households also have to do. I mean, skilling and educating our youth is not just the government's responsibility, it is also their own responsibility. And similarly, the private sector always looks for ease of living, lower taxes, infrastructure, etc. But they also have to invest in R&D and realize the importance of social stability for their own business stability and viability. And therefore, they have to strike the right balance between labor and technology on their part, etc. And they have to pay micro and small and medium enterprises on time for the goods that they purchase. So I think all three segments, the public sector, the private corporate business sector, and the households have to do their part to realize the economic dreams of every Indian.
Absolutely, and that's how we get to that Atmanirbhar and Amrit Kal phase that everybody's been, the government has been talking about and is pushing. But thank you so much for this conversation, Dr. Nageswaran. It was important to highlight some of those aspects where the Indian economy is growing, and we look forward to the next phase, as you said, 7 trillion and more, sooner than probably at the end of the decade. Thank you so much.